Hi, everybody. How's it going? Awesome. I've talked in a lot of funky spaces in my career, but I've never talked in a bar before, so I'm hoping the beer helps. So last week, I finished writing a book on the history of automobile regulation in the United States that goes from 1893, when the first internal combustion engine vehicle was built in this country, to the future with the Google car and autonomous vehicles. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've discovered through my research. But tonight I would like to start with a video. What you're going to be seeing here is that in 2009, to celebrate its 50th anniversary, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety decided to crash some cars together. And they pitted a 1959 Chevy Bel Air, against a 2009 Chevy Malibu. So the Bel Air is not doing well here, if you can't see. Instruments connected to the dummies suggest that the driver in the Bel Air would have died instantaneously, while the dummy in the Malibu would have walked away with minor leg injuries. This is true even though the Bel Air is 1,000 pounds heavier than the Malibu. Moreover, the Bel Air would have put out 99% more of some emissions, some pollutants, and would have used about twice the fuel economy, okay? So this is the question I want to pose for you, is like, something happened between 1959 and 2009. Let's figure out what that is and how that worked. So I'm going to keep coming back to this point over and over. I'm going to define regulations pretty broadly in this talk to just be activities we do to reduce harms and risks around X, often technology. And in this definition, regulation can take many forms, from really formal things like laws to informal things like getting companies together to work out problems. So it's all the things government can do to work on issues, and this is my argument, is that regulations are focusing devices, and that when regulations work, and I will be the first to admit they don't always work, but when they work, they encourage or even force us to create new scientific and engineering knowledge, to form new communities of research, new knowledge communities, and to channel our creativity into positive, socially beneficial innovation. And so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to take a little stroll through the history of the automobile with you and see how this thing has played out again and again. So let's talk about the history of the car. This is the Duryea brothers' first internal combustion engine vehicle from 1893. This is a horseless carriage, literally. They put a small internal combustion engine on the back of it. It's driven with a tiller. It has wooden wheels. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't have seat belts. Cars got fast pretty quickly, though. So by the early aughts, cars are speeding around, and what you see is the rise of this popular character known as the auto fiend. Cars were very expensive in the early years. They're like Lamborghinis now, and so these were young, rich men who were terrorizing local communities. Here's one I really love. It's a postcard from the Smithsonian. You see a trail of dead or damaged bodies, an accident register, a speed record, 2,487 miles an hour. There's a little poem about how fast he goes and such, okay? The first regulations were speed laws. Now, this is pretty basic, right? But even here, regulations acted as focusing devices. And what the focused people to do is people in the market created something called speedometers. Now you think of cars as having speedometers, that's like obvious, right? But the very early cars did not have speedometers. In fact, they were introduced on the market after speed laws came about, because it's like you better keep track of your law. And actually in this advertisement, what the advertisement suggests is that it'll allow you to argue with police officers in court, because you are more objective than they're clocking you, because they would literally watch you from one tree to another and see how fast it along. So it's like, you can argue with this dude in court, no problem. And part of the issue is that when we think about these early years, we have very little sense of what risk meant for these people. So when cars were still going pretty slow, you see this in automotive catalogs from the period. It's a squirt gun, and it says, very effective at keeping off dogs, because if you had a car that had no body, I mean, bodies weren't really standard until the teens, and you're going like 7 miles an hour, an angry dog on a farm would be really dangerous. And apparently what they were doing is filling these things with acid. So I know there's going to be some animal abuse, unfortunately, in this story. Now, here's another example, is the Hercules auto bumper. And what it says, if you look down here, it says it protects your lamps and sometimes dangerous injuries. If you happen to hit a pedestrian, he'll grab the fender before going down, very often saving his or her life. Thus, this device prevents expensive lawsuits. We're in America, right? This is America. So that's the really important part, okay? So what changed to kind of move us from this early period of risk to something else? And the answer is basically this thing, the Ford Model T. Okay, obviously speeds are picking up over time. The Model T is introduced in 1908, 1909. And here's what we see. This is from my doctoral advisor's book, From American System to Mass Production, which you should all read. What it shows is that in 1909, a Ford Model T cost $1,000, and they made about 14,000. But by 1916, through mass production, they had driven the price down to $360, and they were selling almost 600,000 cars. Massive shift in society. In 1905, there were about 80,000 cars, and there were 252 deaths in the United States. The first death is in 1899. In 1920, there's like almost 10 million cars. That's 10 million. 12,000. By 1930, we're up to like 25 million and 30,000 deaths. So this is a massive shift. And people are really concerned. Automotive accidents were on front page news in cities throughout the United States. So this is the period where we see the rise of the first national auto safety movement. And probably the event that did the most to create this movement is this guy, Herbert Hoover, who we just blame him for the Great Depression, but he was a pretty cool dude. He was an engineer, and during this time he was Secretary of Commerce, and in 1924, he held the first national conference on auto safety. Now, what do engineers like to do when they're hanging out and drinking? They like to create technical standards. So what they did is they just standardized everything in the 1920s, okay? So we're going to see that standards play a really important role in the history of automobile regulation, crash tests or standards, tailpipe emission tests or standards. It's amazing how there was a lack of uniform traffic laws in the United States. I have a couple bits of text I want to read you. This is from Herbert Hoover's memoirs after he caused the Great Depression and went into hiding. He wrote a book. So he's talking about the 20s, and he says, "We sent an automobile from New York to San Francisco and another from San Francisco to New York. Each driver was told to follow the laws of his own state and municipality. One of them was arrested 18 times, the other 22 times for violation of laws which differed from his own. The two together met with 16 actual accidents and avoided scores of potential ones only because of their driving skill." So you have to imagine a country where they've created laws at the local level that have nothing to do with one another. right? And so they applied this mode of standardization. They standardized headlights, they standardized brakes, they standardized all these things. I want to tell you one other story that's very related. Let's think about traffic signals for a second. Were they also standardized? So what are traffic signals? Well, the first traffic signal, we think, was created in Salt Lake City by a policeman who took a birdhouse and put electric lights in it. In the late teens and early 20s, these are going to taking off. There's whole new markets. There's all these firms created, mostly by ex-railroad people. This is a technology that moved from the railroad to roads. This is on Fifth Avenue in the early 1920s. You see traffic signals. First of all, they were manned. There was a guy who would sit in there and turn it, but they're also just gorgeous bronze objects, right? I mean, there's like these eagles on the top. But here's the problem, is that traffic signals did not mean what they mean today. So here's a guy, Dr. John Harris is one of the guys who built this thing in New York. He says, the signals flash from the towers indicate the following. Yellow, traffic moves from Fifth Avenue and all across traffic from side street stop. Red, all traffic on Fifth Avenue as well as side street stop. And green, traffic from the side streets proceed. So depending on what city you went to, traffic lights meant different things. Okay, this is dangerous. Now, this is not magic, okay? I'm gonna say, like, regulations are focusing devices that bring people together to solve problems. It's not like, you know, I don't know, they didn't pull rabbits out of hats. They created traffic lights as we know them, and by 1930, the colors that they mean today, they meant it then, right? They standardized color. So in the 20s and 30s, the first national safety movement the idea was that that drivers caused accidents first, and that there were no other risks associated with cars. And so all those safety things we just talked about, traffic lights, brakes, headlights, all these things mentioned are really about increasing the mastery of the car, allowing people to drive well and in an ordered way, okay? Something changes in the 40s and 50s, and there's two new sciences emerge that say, actually, we can think, well, first of all, we have a new problem around the car, and the second thing is we can think about safety in a different way. So I'm going to talk about the science of smog and basically what we call impact biomechanics. So in the 40s, during World War II, they started having a smog problem in LA, more or less. And they were starting to do science, they're trying to figure out what's going on. This Dutch chemist named Arie Hagensmit, now before he worked on smog, Hagensmit was most famous for being a flavor chemist. He is actually the guy who figured out what chemicals make the pineapple flavor. He worked for a pineapple trade association who shipped him tons of pineapples that he would reduce down to a little slurry. It took him weeks just by boiling pineapples in his lab. And then he used a process to isolate the chemical compounds in pineapple. And so then he said, well, why don't we just use this to figure out what smog is? No, that's not what happened. What happened was, while he was doing that, there was this brown stuff kept showing up in his pineapple slurry, and he's like, maybe it's smog, maybe it's this stuff. And it was. And what he did apply the same scientific methods to isolating what smog was, and this is what he found. I wrote this down just to get it right. He found that the cause of smog involved a photochemical reaction. This is what people had been missing before, is you need the sun, between sun, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen oxide. And the way what this led to, the science, is they started creating what they called smog chambers, which is where they would create little minimal, little small, how would they think of them? Spaces of air where they'd reproduce smog using sunlight and these chemicals. Here's Arie Hagensmit by a smog chamber in California. This is a public demonstration. And what he found was that what people assumed that industrial sources like refineries were creating the smog, he discovered that these chemicals were coming out of cars, right? Before this time, you know, people knew that you shouldn't run a car in a garage unless you're very depressed, right? But, you know, now, like, all of a sudden we realize that, that these things produce, you know, air pollution that at the aggregate level is causing damage to human health and plants. So that's the first science. The other science is what we call impact biomechanics or crashworthiness. Now, this is a science that was discovered in a bunch of different places around the country for different reasons. I'm going to tell you about Wayne State. At Wayne State University, there was this guy named Gurgen. He was a surgeon, and he was tired of not understanding how concussion worked. And he thought, like, how does concussion function? I don't know, like, I don't study forces, so I need to team up with someone who studies forces. So he teamed up with this guy, Listener, who was a mechanical engineer. And they started doing some really innovative research. First, they just started, basically what they're doing is taking methods that were developed for testing materials in industry, like in this case, it was a lacquer you would paint on like metal and then put it under stress and see where cracks developed, and that's where the cracks in the metal would develop. So they started applying it to skulls and then dropping skulls on steel plates. But that's pretty, like, that's basic. That's kind of boring, you know, but not exciting at least. What they also, at the same time, this is like the late 30s, early 40s, these things called strain gauges, which are also used to test metal and cement and all these things. They miniaturized them, and these guys are like, what if we put these on bodies? Bones. Dead cadaver bones. And living dogs. So I'm not going to go into the experiment, but this is a dog skull that has been instrumented with strain gauges that they then like put forces to. And I won't go into it. It's very depressing. I've written about the unethical treatment of animals by these folks. I'm not going to tell you about that. They wrote the textbook on how to use these things. Right? They're generating new scientific knowledge. And there's also a little chapter in this book on, like, by the way, you can apply this to bone. But they even got more innovative. So this is the Wayne State University Accelerator. It's a novel scientific instrument / laboratory. It is an elevator shaft that they took the elevator out of and then started dropping cadavers down it. And doing other things. They put them in ejection sheets and either shoot dead bodies up it, like with great force, or they drop things down it to see like how much force can the human body take. I hope none of you are eating right now. This is a dog that died, was not killed, that's embalmed, that they would shoot up to study how forces affected its body. Okay, so there's all these different communities doing this impact biomechanics research all over the United States, but what really brings it all together is this guy, Colonel John Stapp, who worked for the US military. Stapp was a medical doctor, okay? And what happened is he's working on how forces affect jet pilots first. And then, you know, he starts to have these inklings that you can also use it for auto safety, but more importantly, more people in the Air Force were dying in auto accidents than in jet planes. Yeah? So it's like, why not use this for that? So, but mostly he's most famous for shooting himself across the desert at like hundreds of miles an hour to study how, you guys can watch videos of him doing this on YouTube. At one point, in his most famous one, he got up to like 600 miles an hour and then stopped in like less than 2 seconds, like less than a second or something like that. And, you know, it's really gross. His eyeballs turned into bruises. It gets really nasty. And the military told him to stop because they were like afraid he was going to kill himself, you know? He wanted to go even faster. He was a madman. But the important thing is that in 1955, he held the first auto safety conference where he brought all these communities of researchers together to talk, to share knowledge. Okay, this is him hanging out in the elevator shaft. They held like the third or fourth one in Detroit. And he's like, this is a cool thing. I want an elevator shaft, you know. All right, so shocker, guess what? The automakers did not act on this new science voluntarily. I almost decided to not put this slide in because it's too shocking. But this is true. This is true. Okay, so what happened is in the 60s and 70s, we had the birth of federal regulation. So the National Motor Vehicle and Traffic Safety Act of 1966, it created safety standards in cars. It involves this guy, Ralph Nader. He's yeah. Except for he ruined that one election. In 1959, he wrote an article called "The Safe Car You Can't Buy," which highlighted a safety car that had been created at Cornell University. And he's like, this stuff can save our lives. Why can we not get this? And then later he wrote this book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And this was a sleeper. It did not sell well until the president of General Motors had to admit that he hired a private detective to spy on Ralph Nader's love life. And then it was like, oh, bestseller, guaranteed the passage of the law. The law left it up to regulators to set the standards, and the most important standards to these Naderites and others was this thing called Standard 201. And the notion here is called the second collision. So you're not injured when your car runs into a tree, you're injured when your car runs into, you run into your car, rather. So here's how it works. You take this thing that's called a mannequin, and you identify things in the car that your head could hit, like these things. You pull out the material that your head could hit, or sometimes you just pull out the whole instrument panel, like at the top. And then you use this big pendulum to run something called a head form into it at like 30 miles an hour. It has an accelerometer in it. That's it. It doesn't really look like a head. Too bad. And then you try to you measure the G-forces, and you want to limit the G-forces. Pretty simple. They tried to tighten up this standard by making the standard tighter, making it more strict, and putting in a 95th percentile male, a really big male dummy, and a little 5th percentile female, a really small female, and do some other things like create knee and head impact areas. This just says they're using government measures of how big actual Americans are. But the industry opposed this viciously through rulemaking. So they said, first of all, you just don't understand how the industry works. We do not have this much space available to handle your thing. They said, okay, you want to talk about averages? These dudes look pretty similar, but sit them down. We can't talk about average. This argument doesn't work, but they tried it. And they also used this thing called the Wayne curve, which was a representation of how much force the average human being could take. Okay? And what it showed, what this thing was actually they had elderly cadavers they used, and then elderly bodies don't work like young bodies, so they then used pigs. And they averaged the elderly bodies with the pigs, so the federal representation of the average adult human being was an average of adult elderly humans and pigs. They got badly beaten by these industry opposition, and basically they lost a lot. Our safety standards have always been pretty weak. Okay, a female aside, the early standards did have female crash test dummies, but we got rid of the female crash test dummies in the 1970s when we moved to crash tests, and that's why until 2012, when we reinstituted female crash test dummies, more women in the United States have been injured in car crashes than in men. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 worked a little differently. They required automakers, by law, in the law, they didn't ask these guys to set standards. They said, you're going to reduce these 3 emissions by 90%. They also had a really tough regulator named Eric Stork. He loved fighting with industry. He had his daughter cross-stitch a banner that in Latin says, if you grab them by the testicles, their hearts and minds will follow. That was his philosophy of regulation. And so he decided instead of creating standards, he was going to create a surveillance program to watch what the auto industry was doing to see whether they could live up to it and put pressure on them. And what happened is the automakers put billions of dollars into creating a solution. They created whole new communities of knowledge, and eventually it led to the catalytic converter. And the catalytic converter has reduced some of the emissions out of cars by 99% from where they were in 1970. All right, regulations are focusing devices. In the case of auto safety, regulations pushed automakers to translate existing knowledge, all this STAP car crash conference stuff, into actual technology, but not much else. It's like the R&D for safety went up for like a year, and then they never thought about it again because they could just use what was around. In the case of auto emissions, regulations forced automakers to generate new knowledge, form new communities, and create significant innovations. So where do we go from here? I'm jumping a bit, because I got to end. Regulations are focusing devices. The view I'm trying to put forward tonight is somewhere between libertarianism and most kind of boring progressivism. So libertarians would argue that the free market itself is going to give us this stuff. And we can talk about safety as an issue, like consumers now do demand safety. But the automakers were never going to put emissions controls on their cars, nor were they going to generate this knowledge. Progressives, like all my professor friends, they're all like, let's give money to science. They love to say that. And I agree, we should give money to science, but we have been much more effective at generating meaningful innovation in the auto industry through regulation. Let me give you one quick example. George W. Bush was really into hydrogen vehicles and put millions of dollars into research into hydrogen vehicles. On the bottom, that's George Bush. This is a parking lot full of all the hydrogen vehicles that don't exist. Right? It hasn't happened. And I can show this with other examples too, where we just have not generated meaningful innovation through federal research programs. Regulations are focusing devices. There's these things out there. This is the Google car, one version of it. A lot of people who are into auto safety and stuff, emissions, fuel economy, put a lot of hope in this. I will be right there in line to buy the first one. I'm not anti-self-driving car, but I also think that when we focus too much on full autonomy, we overlook a lot of available technologies that we should push into all vehicles right now, like lane departure warning systems and radar-actuated cruise control. If you've never driven a car with radar-actuated cruise control, it is sweet, let me tell you. And it's much safer in all kinds of ways. So regulations are focusing devices. Some people have said, what if we treated safety like emissions control? So again, with emissions, we just said, let's reduce these things by 90%. What would automakers do today if we mandated that they must reduce the number of auto fatalities in new vehicles, say by 40% or something like that, in 10 years? What would they do? You think they would move to self-driving cars? What would they do? Seriously, I have no idea. And I think the bigger question, finally, is how can we apply this thinking and how can we apply these tools of regulatory standards for the public good to the public good, including in combating global climate change? Thank you.